I will first put this lecture in the context of the set of 5, and then we shall begin. So, December the 7th, I believe, I will be giving my 5th lecture, where we will finally arrive at the Greek temple as the paradigm for the classical, and the title of that lecture will be Apollo in Arcadia. And that has been our goal all along. This lecture is very much a part of that trajectory. Now, necessarily, this involves taking seriously not just the artifacts of the ancient Greeks and Romans and those who emulated them, but taking seriously what the original larger context was, and the larger context, of course, is a religious context, and that's what this slide foregrounds. And there is also, therefore, the larger religious context. Context for what? Of course, for architecture, and its place within the whole. And these two images, which I will return to next week, nicely frame that. Thomas Cole's The Expulsion from the Garden, and the other part of this diptych, the garden itself. Now, why this is necessary to be so fundamental is nicely illustrated by this image, which I've already shown you. I showed this to you in the first lecture. An image coming out of the Enlightenment which posits the fundamentals of architecture and ultimately makes a case for the fundamentals of architecture being the permutations of stuff, i.e. shelter, necessity, deriving from the body, and ultimately the tectonics of stuff to facilitate shelter. Now, this is a part of a larger trajectory in the history of architecture that is beautifully encapsulated by this very handy book, which also points to the fundamental issue in its title, even though it takes a stand that I have to strongly disagree with, but we'll return to that next week. So, stuff. We're made of stuff. We live in a cosmos full of stuff. But there's something about when we look up at the night sky in its various permutations that suggests that there are things that are involvement and obsession with the everydayness of things goes far beyond. And of course, that is exactly why it was important to look, however glancingly, at the earliest, as far as we know now, comprehensive set of art, as we generally call it, in around 35,000 BC in the Chavot Cave, and suggesting that what that place was, and it's hard to avoid it, most people get it even without being so reflexive or theoretical, it's a kind of sanctuary. I was suggesting that this too represents a kind of sanctuary, even though in this painting these are shown as shelters, but this is our farewell to the Paleolithic world, a very dangerous world, as this painting beautifully highlights. Nonetheless, a world that most of humanity has lived in before the emergence of agriculture and cities, and then last time we looked at this mysterious monument, which is significant, not because it's necessarily beautiful, and certainly far from intelligible to us, still, but because it is the earliest known monumental human construction, and very nicely, it's made up of monoliths. What can be more monumental in the Stone Age than giant pieces of stone? And this predates Stonehenge, which is the most familiar one, by about 6,000 to 7,000 years. So, important. But today, we have to go into modern times. So, 100 years ago, last Sunday, the terrible war, which really was the worst war in human history, the worst slaughter in human history because it was slaughter at an industrial scale, came to an end in what was called an armistice, which is a cessation of hostilities while negotiations then proceed to try to work out some more permanent peace. That permanent peace never came. There have been stretches of peace nonetheless in the last 100 years, but certainly not a permanent peace. And at the heart of that tragedy is a trajectory which certainly comes out of the 18th century and the first monumental eruption of those disorders is that stretch of time we know as the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. So, this image I put in as iconic of the world before. This is a painting from the late 17th century, 1696. It is a painting dedicated to Saint Geneviève, the original intended occupant, as it were, of the church that we now know as the Pantheon in Paris. And you see her hovering above in the clouds. It's truly a ravishing painting, and in the background, in a kind of monumental urn, is an artifact which represents her earthly remains, her relics, which used to be carried in procession around Paris for many centuries whenever Paris was threatened by war or by disease or any other trauma. All this came to an end, and it came to an end in what is represented by this image, which is called, it's actually in French, the Serment in the Jeu de Paume. It's basically otherwise known as the tennis court oath. The Jeu de Paume was a tennis court, and it was an oath to start from zero as far as the life of every Frenchman in the domains of the then Kingdom of France. That is the real beginning of the French Revolution. The beginning that we remember happened several weeks later in the rebellion that we know as the fall of the Bastille, which is July 14th. The painter who started that painting never finished the painting because the series of events that were set in motion by this tennis court oath, this promise to remake everything from the ground up, from within the horizon of reason and reason alone, resulted in less than happy events. And so poor David, he had to abandon his canvas. And this is the state of the canvas as it stands today. And sadly, more than half of the individuals depicted in that canvas had lost their heads by the time he abandoned the canvas, and therefore were non-persons, and therefore were certainly not going to be celebrated. And unlike the later Soviets, where regularly in representations of Soviet history with every new edition, as the years went on, there were fewer and fewer people standing on the podium of Lenin's tomb with Stalin until basically there was almost only Stalin. But that was easier to do. You just airbrush these people out. It would be hard to airbrush this crowd of people. The voids would speak eloquently, and that's really the subject of today's talk. The present, the absent present, as it were. So, interestingly, in spite of the horrors of what followed immediately 1789 through 1815, the trauma that was initiated and that convulsed the whole of Europe eventually came to an end on the field of battle at Waterloo. It's become a trope now. When you say Waterloo, it represents an end. And although there were certainly wars in Europe in the remainder of the 19th century, the trajectory of the 19th century, in spite of some pretty serious convulsions like 1870, 1871, nonetheless was a century of what we very much call progress. Things were getting better for more and more people in Europe. The the industrial revolution was taking off in a big way. And the glories of the positive side of what followed the French Revolution were appropriately celebrated in Paris at the Great Paris World Fair of 1900. Now, 1900 was the last year of the 19th century, not the first year of the 20th century. Because our numbering system, as I've said before to some of you, is an ancient Roman system. It moves from 1 to 10. That's what makes it the base 10 system. It doesn't go from 0 to 9. So, whether at that time, actually a lot of people at that time had forgotten that, and so they thought that they were celebrating the beginning of the 20th century. They were really celebrating the end of the 19th century, and this image from that World's Fair is a beautiful image to symbolize those conflicts in the 19th century. That huge tower, which will be the most familiar to you, of course, the Tour Eiffel, was made for it was a tower that celebrated the French Revolution, actually, for the World's Fair of 1889, and around it you had images of essentially the history of world architecture, both in its immediate vicinity and along the Seine. And there you see the industrial smokestacks. And the big technical tour de force for the 1900 exhibit was a colossal Ferris wheel. So the big Ferris wheel in London was an old idea. It's been around. Okay, this next image focuses on, in spite of all that, the world that still was there. This is a lovely image, also taken around 1900 from the Grand Canal in Trieste, on the northern Adriatic, on the eastern side. And so in 1900, there were still clipper ships. In 1900, the oceans were largely full of sailing ships. In 1900, most people lived in buildings made of brick and stone and made of wood, and there were huge continuities between the world of 1900 and the world before 1789. And then came the First World War. The First World War, in the ways presented, is often either presented as the inevitable result of fundamental structural failings of the political system of Europe at the time, or some unaccounted for accident. What triggered it was clearly accidental in a fundamental way. It was an assassination, and the way the Austrians reacted to that assassination. But more fundamentally, the First World War was a necessary consequence of what was percolating in the 18th century and what erupted in 1789. Now, that's a huge topic. That's not my topic for today. That's merely sketching the big picture. My topic for today is the reaction to the First World War in the immediate end of the First World War the first decade and a half following the end of the First World War. And how complicated that ending was, I know of no better book. This book, appropriately entitled 1918, War and Peace by Gregor Dallas, a superb book which shows that, in fact, not even the fighting really ended 100 years ago. And much was churning that played itself out in the subsequent 2 decades and ultimately resulted in the Second World War, which itself was not a consequence simply of the failures of the peace conference that we call the Versailles Treaty of 1919. So, right from the beginning, figures of cultural import and responsibility began to think of, even in the closing years of the First World War, in other words, while it was going on, how they were going to commemorate it. And so this is one of those commemorations. It is a painting by an American painter, John Singer Sargent. He was commissioned by the British government to paint a painting for an institution that was being contemplated, or that was being expanded at the time, the Imperial War Museum in London. So it's sometimes thought of as an American painting. It is a painting that reflects on the pity, the horror, the reality of war. It is a rather large painting. That's why I showed you that photograph it's currently a part of a major exhibition in London. And it's certainly very far from the kind of John Singer Sargent paintings that you're more familiar with. He was very much the painter of the optimistic side, the positive side of the 19th century. Here's a detail of that painting. The painting is full of ambiguities. While you have these victims of a gas attack in the foreground, in the background you have some soldiers playing soccer. It is the kind of painting that nonetheless, in mood, is very, very different from the tradition of painting, even when it commemorates the horror and the pity of war. And this is a beautiful historical painting from one of my favorite painters, Victor Mihailovich Vasnestov, painting a subject out of Russian history that also became the subject of a great opera by Borodin in the 19th century, Prince Igor. So it is after the battle, the fruits of the battle, as it were. This is also not a lecture about painting, but since a lot of you are painters and are interested in painting, I'm beginning by foregrounding painting because it foregrounds the dilemma facing artists in 1918, 100 years ago, how to incorporate the meaning, the experience, in fact, what meaning to discover out of the horrors of industrialized slaughter. And this painting is also a painting that had real-life resonance, as you can see from this photograph. But it is not simply a painted photograph. It is also a tradition of painting. It's a part of a tradition of painting that can be read very symbolically and therefore metaphorically. Pieter Bruegel the Elder, a 16th century painter, and the subject of the painting is, of course, the blind leading the blind. So, you can also read Singer Sargent's painting as a kind of metaphorical reflection on how we got into this mess in the first place, and not merely about the victims of the mess, or one category of victims about the mess. The reality of war on the ground did not obviously lend itself to painting, to beautiful paintings, or even to particularly interesting paintings. This is a photograph from 1917 of a break a moment of break in the battle for soldiers who are heading towards the front line and the slaughterhouse. Another painting that captures that break, so to speak, is another painting of John Singer Sargent's A Street in Arras, where on what was once a lovely 18th century street, you have this colossal sword that has been thrown into it, and you have a bunch of Scottish soldiers. What are Scottish soldiers doing in a French street? Well, it's because they're part of rescuing France. Well, this was more like the everyday reality, in between barrages of artillery, a desolate landscape, a landscape truly hardly of this earth. And here is an aerial photograph of what the front actually looked like. So, of all the casualties, 80% were blown to pieces by artillery. And that's what you see. There's a detail, and even today, on the parts that have not been aggressively restored to agricultural use, the scars are there. Well, for the English-speaking world, one of the most famous points on this battlefield was the town of Ypres. The town of Ypres was that tiny bit of Belgium that was not occupied by Germany, but was on the front line, and it was basically pulverized. And here we see a photograph, again from 1917, of Australian troops, this time heading into battle through the ruins of Ypres. And here we have the monument in Ypres, which was created to commemorate those who died on those battlefields. And it's called the Menin Gate. It was started in the late teens, and it was completed just under a decade later. In 1927, this is a photograph from the inauguration of that monument. And as you can see, in less than 10 years, the city of Ypres was reconstructed, was rebuilt. Reginald Bloemfeld is the architect, and he created this gate in the old city wall at the point of the moat. Here you see the outside. The outside of the gate. So what does the gate commemorate? It commemorates those for whom there are no bodies, just names. This is a painting by an Australian painter, Will Longstaff, and it's in the Australian War Memorial in Australia's capital, Canberra. We take these monuments, in a sense, for granted because they're familiar with us, but they're exceptional monuments because before this, most dead on the battlefield were buried in mass graves. The more famous dead may be carried back to their homeland. And there was no category of monuments for those whose bodies no longer remained. And this is one of those monuments. This is one of the most famous, of course, by the great British architect Lutyens. It's the Triumphal Memorial for the battlefield of the Somme. I'm not going to be spending too much time with these, just introducing them to the category of monuments before we arrive at how it came about that we were making these sorts of monuments, which is a series of interesting historical contingencies. What did Lutyens do? He created something that resembles a triumphal arch with an altar in it. Here's a photograph of that arch on the day that it was dedicated in 1932, with the heir to the throne then, the Prince of Wales, the soon-to-be briefly Edward VIII, with the President of France. But when you look at the arch from the air, you have a better understanding of what Lutyens created. He created a triumphal arch of sorts, which was in fact the crossing of a great outdoor cathedral, which was also alighted with a cemetery. And this is also clear from the image from the other direction. So, likewise, all the names there are the names of the missing from the battles on the Somme. Now, last Sunday, there were very solemn ceremonies around the monument, which for the English-speaking world is the monument through which people iconically remember the First World War, this famous cenotaph. This is not a photograph taken from last Sunday, but from a few years earlier, but the ceremonies have been pretty much identical from year to year for the better part of a century. This is one of the last in which Her Majesty the Queen participated. She's that tiny figure in the foreground, in the center of the image. And when we come closer to ground level, you see her, actually she's hidden by her son and grandsons on the lower left of this image. And the commemorative plant, which is ubiquitous, is of course the poppy. And here you see an image of the cenotaph after the ceremonies with many, many wreaths made of poppies. Now, poppies themselves are not an obvious plant to relate to this business of remembering. Their contingent entering into the story has more to do with what it turns out is, in fact, something of what I like to call a natural symbol. Here's a photograph from 1918, an Australian collecting poppies in another field of battle. This is in Palestine. Now, all of you, hopefully, are familiar with this poem, and I will leave the poem on the screen for you to read. It's a very famous poem. It was written by a Canadian who was also one of the victims of the First World War. It's not a great piece of poetry. That's not its significance. It was written by a witness. It's a little bit of doggerel verse, but it is still nonetheless very eloquent. So, the war went on. This is a painting that commemorates what's called the Second Battle of Ypres from May 1915 by a British artist by the name of Richard Jack, who was commissioned by the Canadian government to paint a series of paintings that would memorialize Canada's participation in the war. There are many paintings like this. There's a whole tradition of painting. And in fact, you see paintings of this similar sort of style and even content in a museum just south of us here in Springville. They're Soviet paintings, but they come out of the great tradition of paintings. Richard Jack, who was educated, like many of the most ambitious, talented painters in Paris, not in London, and he was a student at one of the great ateliers. And then he won a big prize at the exhibition of 1900. And so he was a mature painter who it was not surprising that the Canadians were very eager to get to paint paintings that memorialize their efforts. And then the war suddenly came to an end. It didn't quite so suddenly came to an end. What basically happened were two things. The Germans simply wore themselves out. The French and the British and all the other members of the British Empire who were fighting on the Western Front also wore themselves out. And then a new player came in, the United States. And it came in at exactly the same time as finally the British and the French learned how to defeat the Germans. They barely survived. The year before, there were huge mutinies on the Western Front. The French army almost laid down its arms. There had to be a huge shake-up at the top, and so charging into barbed wire was stopped finally, and into machine guns' nests. And they learned to coordinate artillery with activity on the ground. And we're looking at the Place de la Concorde in February of 1919, a few months at the end of the war, with trophies. Those of you who've been taking my classes at the BAA, we've been talking about trophies. These are 20th century trophies. These are tanks and other pieces of artillery that were set up and ornamented the Place de la Concorde. So that was the first victory monument in Paris. In fact, it was the only victory monument, really, in Paris. So we went from that to this, the cenotaph. And it is an interesting story. And it is a story, of course, that is the story of very gifted and visionary individuals being in the right place at the right time. It was not a monument that was supposed to survive the ceremonies that celebrated the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. What was made for those ceremonies was this. Here's an early colored photograph. A long exposure, as you can tell, that is not webbing or giant spiders creating a web. It's just people moving and traffic moving. But the original monument was a temporary monument. It was a temporary monument made of wood and lath and plaster. And it was only made to stand for the duration of the ceremonies. And I'll show you a couple of images of it before I tell you how it came into being. First of all, it was designed exactly 2 weeks before the ceremonies. So the capacity of these people to build spectacularly, design spectacularly, and execute puts us to shame, I suggest. Well, just like Ypres, rebuilt in less than 10 years. And if you'd go there, you wouldn't know that it was a city that was blasted to smithereens, unlike the World War II cities, which you know very well when you visit them today, that they were blasted to smithereens. And so here is a drawing, painting, I think. It's a lithograph of the celebration, the parade. Here's a photograph of the same parade. It was one of a number of temporary monuments, as I said. Its significance was that 2 weeks before the parade was supposed to happen, the Prime Minister at the time, David Lloyd George, it occurred to him, hey, we don't have anything that brings to mind all the dead. Now think about that. They've been planning this for a long time. Fortunately, the Prime Minister realized we need something to commemorate those who died. It's sort of grotesquely humorous, I think. And it's just so happened that he was told to consult someone who was already then probably the premier architect in Britain at the time, Lutyens, and he said, well, what I have in mind is something like those monuments that people build in royal funerals that symbolize the coffin of the deceased. And Lutyens thought about it and he said, you mean something like a cenotaph? The word cenotaph was utterly unknown at this point generally in English, because it is a Greek word. and it means an empty tomb, or a representative tomb. So Lloyd George said, yes, yeah, could you throw something together for me? And that's basically what Lutyens did, and then with some very good carpenters and plasterers, they built this very substantial monument because it's almost 40 feet tall. Here's a painting of the Victory Parade. The parade's name in the literature is a little conflicted. Sometimes it's called the Victory Parade, sometimes it's called the Peace Parade. And it occurred on the 19th of July. The peace was signed on the 28th of June, which is exactly 5 years after the assassination, which triggered the First World War. The French celebrated their parade, of course, on the 14th of July. The two parades were not simultaneous because dignitaries from one were going to be participating in the other as allies. And here is, I didn't work in as many Canadian subjects as I did deliberately. It just turns out the best painting of this parade shows the Canadian flag. That's that big red ensign in the middle of the painting. So the Canadians parading next to the arch. So at this point, why were they not parading through the arch? Here is this colored photograph, which shows why. What was in the center of the arch was the sort of monument that David Lloyd George had in mind. It's called a catafalque, this monumental tomb. This echoes two others, at least, which were positioned in the center of the arch, that of Victor Hugo at the end of the 19th century, which I showed a photograph of 2 months ago, and also Napoleon. So that is what the French built to commemorate their dead. Well, you know, you can hardly beat the Arc de Triomphe. Its setting, its scale, its artistry. And then for the Victory Parade proper, it was moved to the side, and you had the representative victorious troops then moving through the center of the arch. This is where the French eventually placed their Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, which is where it is today. Now, Lutyens could have ended up making a similar sort of monument. He certainly did as a war memorial in other parts of London. This is his war memorial in Leicestershire. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing the name. Instead, he gave us this. So his challenge was in many ways fairly direct and straightforward. He was asked to produce a monument which didn't have too much obvious cultural resonance, because the dead on the Western battlefront were both Protestants, Catholics, Buddhists, Muslims, many others. Japan was an ally at the time, so all of these needed to be commemorated, so it is interesting to follow the design trajectory, which, remember, had to be a matter of hours, if no more than a couple of day or so, before they set to building it. Here is the sketch which shows basically the final idea as he jotted it on a menu when he was showing it to Lloyd George. Apparently that's the legend or the myth. I suspect it's probably not that straightforward because we have too many other sketches. Here's another sketch, maybe for the alternate idea, which was to surmount it with a huge urn at the top and a fire, so a kind of eternal flame. That this idea was more than just a passing idea is witnessed to by this drawing, which shows it as worked out as a design drawing that you could immediately go to working drawings to. That was not the original. I mean, it was sort of the beginning, but it wasn't the real beginning. Here's his actual beginning. He started literally with an ancient Greek monument. He started with a well-known monument. Of course, it had to be well-known because it's right up there at the entry to the Acropolis. It's called the Monument of Agrippa, by the person who last inscribed his name on it, Augustus's famous general. But it was in fact built in probably the late 2nd, early 1st century BC, or actually probably no. Late 2nd century BC by King of Pergamon, an Attalid, one of the Attalids we don't know because the inscription doesn't survive. It belongs to a category of monuments that are basically plinths for statues. Large statues, this had a quadriga, in other words, 4 horses and a chariot. This is one that has been reconstructed at Delphi. It had a horseman. And just to show you that it belongs to a very ubiquitous late classical Hellenistic iconic monument. This is a model of the front of the Temple of Delphi with a whole group of these monuments, and here's a reconstruction of one of them. So what he did was he took this base, and in his inimitable, literally inimitable, because nobody has successfully imitated what he called the elemental mode, he pared it down and then made it a base for a coffin in masonry, over which was to be draped the flag. Here is the flag would not have worked very well with the urn, and so we ended up with the sketch that ultimately gave us. These were his working drawings for that monument, so literally within a day or so of his receiving the commission very quickly, because this is how things were done in those days. Even then, even in a more educated age, the client couldn't necessarily see what you meant from a drawing, so they made a model. They presented it to the cabinet, and they said, yes, excellent, go with it. So 2 weeks later, there it was. And the parade came and went, and the crowds of people didn't stop. And so it became a part of probably about more than 1 million Londoners filed past it, and from all over England to lay wreaths, not poppies yet. The poppies have yet to come into the picture. Although the poem was already well known. Here you see a photograph. That was a very fine drawing showing the enormous popularity. And because of this, they didn't demolish the monument right away, because the people kept on coming and laying wreaths. And there was a big debate. It was right in the middle of traffic in the busiest street in Westminster. And the popular outcry was no. We want it there, and we want it exactly as it is. Here's a book published a couple of months later to commemorate the first anniversary of the end of the war, the 1st November. The 11th celebration, and smack in the middle is a drawing of our cenotaph. So, this is a monument, a genuinely popular classical monument, which captured the imagination, and it's easy to tell the difference, I'll show you in a second, between the original monument and the photographs of the later monument. It's because the original monument had an actual flag over the coffin, and it had wreaths at either end, i.e. these were not bronze or colored stone. And so Lutyens was persuaded, well, he didn't need to be persuaded. He was asked, okay, what could you do to make it exactly like that? And he said, well, it's not quite perfect yet. Let me work on it a little bit. And this is eventually what he came up with. So it's not a one-to-one replica. What he introduced was antithesis and inward inclination. He said it needs to have all the refinements of the great works of Greek architecture, which turn what would be rectilinear and inert into something sculptural and alive. So, there are no vertical or straight lines in this monument. but the curvatures are minuscule and yet nonetheless palatable. So, it was because of this monument that the ceremony that we now know, in other words, the first wooden one, was created the year following the original armistice on November the 11th, 1919. That monument was in pretty dilapidated state because with English weather, with all that rain and damp, all that plaster and wood wasn't doing too well, but they kept it up, and it was in this context that King George V had a very smart idea. Why don't we, for the following year, create a memorial for all the dead that is a permanent memorial? And that was when the idea of the unknown, we call it the unknown soldier, he was called the unknown warrior at the time, came about. And furthermore, because the idea came from the king, and the king, being a proper king, understood the appropriate iconography, he said, why don't we then take one of the bodies of somebody whose identity is unknown in France and bring them back and bury them in Westminster Abbey with the other kings of England. So, there it is. The following year, the monument in Portland stone is finished, and here it is being inaugurated with the unknown warrior given a royal burial, and it was at this point that the king placed a wreath on the coffin like a crown. And so you see the body arriving and being received. Here's another photograph from a participant from the stands. And then moments after, the flags have been taken down, the monument is revealed. The king then places the wreath on the coffin, and then the coffin comes by. And here is the plaque where in the center of Westminster Abbey is the tomb. So these were serious people back then. And then the wreaths kept on coming. So let us get to why the poppy. And coming, and coming. And so through many of the subsequent decades, because certainly many Englishmen knew people directly, sons, fathers, brothers, and also close relatives and even friends, of course, many friends. Wreaths kept on being placed on the monument at all times of year. So this is a photograph from the late 1930s. So that is the cenotaph. So meanwhile, here in North America, in New York, there was also a parade. This parade was a little earlier. It was in March of 1919. And here we see a parade from the returning troops. So this is not tied to the dates that I've already given you. There was a monument made for this parade. This is a photograph from in front of it had just barely opened a couple of years earlier, the New York Public Library by the great Carrera and Hastings. Hastings was asked to build a monumental arch, and boy did he build a monumental arch. Again, made of lath and plaster. Here's a photograph to give you a scale across Fifth Avenue. With those obelisks represent all the different parts of the American war machine as it contributed to the victory in northern France. Here is an aerial showing something of the scale of this celebration. And here is the model, the Arch of Constantine. There was some pressure and some enthusiasm to make it permanent, but not enough. And it being not England, but North America, and there being no kings or other institutions to make things have a little bit more of a lasting momentum. Instead, this is what ultimately was built, a base for a flagpole. It is certainly one of the moving, beautiful flagpole bases anywhere by Thomas Hastings. It is just next to where the arch was, one of the legs of the arch. It's called the Eternal Light flagstaff. It has the names of major battles that American troops fought in 1918. It's beautifully executed, beautifully detailed, a very beautiful bronze base for the flagstaff. And this is where the ceremonies on November the 11th happen in New York. It's kind of sad. Here's an overall picture. Fortunately, the cultural momentum at the top was such that when the British inaugurated their idea, which again came out of this nexus of events, ultimately it was the presence of the cenotaph. The idea was, what are we going to do with what was close to 1 million British Empire dead in northern France, bodies? Are we going to bring them home? The logistics of that, of course, were horrendous. Or are we going to bury them on the battlefield? Well, we can't just bury them on the battlefield. We have to build monuments. And so the British began that process of building monuments, of which you saw Lutyens as being one of the great examples. And all those youngsters who are now very established or practicing architects in North Americas with a French background said, well, we should do the same. And so a commission was set up, and here is John Russell Pope's monument, which is a colossal column, a very beautiful monument. At the Meuse Argonne front, there you see it in its context. There you see it closer up, and it has a statue of Liberty at the very top. It is also a tomb. And this is said to be the largest of the American monuments. And it is in the context of the ruined village. This is the ruined church on the hill that it shares. There were at least 11 major American monuments. Pope designed one. The architect who designed the largest number was a Frenchman, actually, by the name of Paul-Philippe Cray, and this is his Pennsylvania Memorial at Varennes in the Argonne. So these are just representative. I'm going to focus on another monument, which is a tholos. It's the Montserrat American Monument. It was completed in 1930, and the architect was Egerton Swartwout. And it is probably the most beautiful, at least for me, the most beautiful of all these monuments. So there you see it in its context, and it's on a large hill in a rather extraordinary landscape. It is at the point where the American army broke the back of the German army. And it is a circle of columns surrounding a cella, which has been opened up into piers that are lighted with the columns, as you can see here, with a very large oculus open to the sky. And it commands the landscape. And it's made of, fortunately, it's made of granite, so it won't melt away the way marble monuments melt away. And I will take you on a brief tour of it. So we were looking at it from the back, and now we're approaching it from its normal approach from the front, with this cascade of stairs which descends from it, through which you ascend through the columns. And you see the center, and you see a kind of altar in the center. And then the sky above, there you see the cascade of stairs. That's how high up it is. Now, this shows the horrendous task was given to the American army to take this hill from the Germans, because it was it was a part of the last. It was a salient, so it was a fortified part of the front that had not been overcome, that was projecting into the battle lines. Here we're looking back. It was also a very wet landscape, so not just the height, but fighting through swamps. And so Egerton Swartwout produced this truly beautiful commemorative monument to remember those who need to be remembered. And in the center, well, it has inscriptions in the attic throughout the center. So the inscriptions are on the inside for the most part, not on the outside. And you have an altar-like entity in the center, as you can see. You have the various parts of the forces which fought are commemorated by various heraldic emblems with the eagle, very beautiful. The lettering is spectacular. And then we're very curious about what's there, the altar. But before we do, let's look out at the landscape. And then back at the altar. It's a very beautiful altar. It's done very much in a Greek fashion. And what it has is a bronze map of the battlefield and the red are the lines of the Allies and the German lines on November the 11th, 1918. And because it's bronze, and so it deals with problems of, problems of weather quite nicely. And it has a nice greenish patina, which is also very appropriate. And you look up at the sky. So it is, it captures the spirit perfectly in a monument on the battlefield that Lutyens captured perfectly in his very Greek-style monument in the center of London. It combines the essentially architectural with a kind of natural symbolism. So, the monument is an oculus, it is an altar, and it is a place of remembering. It's very cultural in terms of immediate time, non-specificity, combined with its awe-inspiring beauty that allows it to touch the pathos of what it commemorates, which makes it timeless. And yet a part of the trajectory of our culture, because it goes back to the very roots of our culture. You don't make effective monuments by zeroing in too much on the particulars. The particulars of battle and war, captured in photographs, in engravings, in illustrations, in paintings, do not translate very well into the third dimension. That astonishing landscape again. And we're going to move away slowly from our monument. If you let me speak a little bit, I'll show you one more monument and then conclude. Unfortunately, the best architect's drawing I could find is from an article that I'd have to pay too much money to get off the internet, so I just accepted the tiny little snapshot. But this is the architect's design idea, and very much what he realized. And here is, fortunately, his signature is there on the monument. There he is, Egerton Swartwout, architect, AD 1932, American Battle Monuments Commission. And it wasn't his only monument. He was a very fairly successful architect. He comes out of the office of McCameed and White, and his most extraordinarily beautiful North American monument. I've shown a number of you the Mary Baker Eddy Monument in Mount Auburn Cemetery. And I show it to you because there is a local monument which falls within the horizon of the typology, which is, of course, your Memory Grove monument, which is also a World War I monument. It is a World War I monument that needs a little bit of help. There is this placeholder on top of the bronze pedestal in the center that could use something a little bit more serious and more commemorative, whether a statue or a bronze or marble urn, and the monument could use some monumental lettering, inscription in the entablature, some ornament, and that's what the BAA Utah is going to be exploring as 3 phases of a series of esquisses the rest of this year. So the one other monument is the least familiar and the most idiosyncratic, and that is the Canadian National Monument at Vimy, which was another major battlefield and hill. And what's significant about this monument, other than being so astonishingly beautiful and moving, is that it was designed by a sculptor, not an architect, who in fact produced something that combines the sculptural with the elemental mode of Lutyens at his cenotaph. It frames a statue that represents Canada mourning, and that's what the statue is in the foreground. I've shown a number of these pictures before to some of you. So he, with his team, carved the whole thing. It has this whole series of allegories in the other sculptural groups. The way the statue is framed, given its scale, it's the most monumental medium-sized statue, I think, ever. Here's a photograph of the sculptor Walter Allward. He was educated in Toronto. He's from my own hometown, and his other major monument is the Lutyens Memorial of just around 1910. So it was just 20 years before he designed the other one. And the reason why I'm showing you, not just to make the biographical point, but to show you formally, is the monuments form a kind of diptych, because here you have the obelisk with the victory, and here you have the void where the obelisk would be. That is the model that won him the competition. There is his original design sketch for the idea, and it is uncannily close, although not literally, that of the executed monument. Here's the competition, and the competition's pretty good, really. If we had a competition which gave us this array of monuments, other than the obvious choice, the other ones, any of the other ones would have been fine. But it was exceptional, and so this is it. I'll move through it a little bit more quickly. It also has a cenotaph, and there is the cenotaph below the statue is an inscribed tomb with a sword, with a helmet, and with an inscription in Latin, because after all, these are still the monuments of 100 years ago, where Latin would have been a language which most educated people would have at least encountered in public school and high school, certainly in the English-speaking world. And here is Canada mourning over the tomb with this extraordinary parapet with her garment just draped over. And here is the sculptor about to carve one of the reclining figures. There's the reclining figure, the eventual. And this is the way the monument looks from the top of the ridge. That's where the two reclining figures are, framing the sky and the the gap, as it were, the caesura, the break, and the monolith. Here is the sculpture being carved. The sculpture was carved in situ, and so you had to build in this miserable climate of northern France, which is damp and cold a lot of the time, to protect the sculptors while they were carving the sculpture, and they eventually gave us that. This too is a monument, which has many names, similar to the ones that I already showed you, the Menin Gate and the monument by Lutyens, the Great Arch, the Triumphal Arch. There you see the names being carved, the resultant names. And it has been the focus of pilgrims from Canada coming to remember the missing for many, many decades. It was recently restored, and these are photographs from the restored. So when Maya Lin came up with her idea as a very ambitious and talented undergraduate at Yale for the Vietnam War Memorial that she eventually won, the idea of names was hardly new. The idea of an act of violence on which to inscribe the names itself was hardly new, because in a strange way, not in a strange way, in a very quiet but emphatic way, that's what the Canadian monument embodies. But the problem with her monument is it's way too minimal. It only works in the winter when there's hardly anybody visiting, when a new blanket of snow has covered it, when you have the contrast between the black granite and the names and the snow. The rest of the time, you have all the paraphernalia of a much visited site, and so the conceptual has to give way to the contingent, all too contingent, and the idea is more powerful than the reality. This is not the case with the monuments that I've been showing you. I'm now going to show you the plan, some contemporary drawings and photographs with the names that are foregrounded. On that same hill are the remains of some of the trenches that have been made a little bit more permanent by replacing the sandbags with cast cement bags. Here is a plan of the trenches around the monument and the battlefield, and here are some photographs from the battle where the Canadians, it was their first major engagement on the battle on the Western Front, what the battlefield actually looked like during the battle, and not something that really forms the subject of a very successful painting, horrible scenes such as this. However, our painter, Richard Jack, did paint a painting of the commencement of the battle. So there you see the ridge that needs to be taken. There you see the Canadian artillery bombarding the ridge, and that horrible ground in between. So it's again one of those threshold moments rather than in the unfolding moment. Scenes there, the victorious troops after the battle. And here is the first monument on the battlefield that was made by the soldiers in one of the huge craters. They created a kind of pebble mosaic and then a cross on a cairn above it. And then we have our monument. So, for an ICA trip, northern France, the monuments, would be a great idea. And a real education in architecture as well as history. Here's a postcard from that period. Here's a miserable newspaper photograph showing the ceremonies to inaugurate our monument. Here is the Prince of Wales with the President of France and other dignitaries, including Canadian dignitaries. Here's a rather melancholy postcard from that day. That was the written part. This is the front of the postcard. And so we say goodbye to our monument, and sure enough, our monument too received a very, very eloquent painting by that Australian painter, Will Longstaff, and this painting hangs in the Parliament buildings in Ottawa. So, to conclude, there's a very good book which charts the trajectory of how it was that the idea to create this monument came into being. It's appropriately entitled The Empires of the Dead. And you have the poppy, so I was going to tell you why the poppy. Well, terrible things happen to the ground when it's ground away, as it were, when it becomes the scene of the kinds of battles that went on in World War I. What happens to the ground is that plants stop growing in it because the acidity rises, and because it's a limestone base, you have lime and mixing with the rain. So the poppy is one of the few plants that actually survives in this landscape. And so it's a natural symbol. And it was actually an American lady who thought of selling poppies to commemorate November the 11th, and the idea took off, and eventually the British embraced it. And so today you see fields of poppies surrounding the monuments in England and in northern France. And it is certainly an appropriate monument, but it didn't come out of nowhere. Every one of these things happens because somebody has an idea that is then shared and takes off and becomes a part of the culture. So I heartily recommend this book along with the book 1918, and a third book that deals with the very beginning of the war in the first 6 months in 1914 is entitled appropriately Catastrophe. 1914, Europe Goes to War by Max Hastings, who's a very good historian and a very good writer. A little bit about the casualties. It was horrific when I learned that more than 80% of the casualties were not from machine guns or from bullets from rifles or from the bayonets, but simply from artillery. You can't escape that. So whether you die or whether you live, it's certainly not in your hands. And it's astonishing that as many people lived as they did. But just to give you a few numbers, World War I, about 10 million soldiers died, about 10 million civilians. But in 1918, on this planet, another 50 to 100 million people died from what we call the Spanish flu or the influenza. It was far more catastrophic. And it took mostly young people because it was a form of influenza that created as influenza often does, a very violent allergic reaction where the body's immune system goes into overdrive, and mostly died from pneumonia. But we have no defense from that still. So, meanwhile, what about Washington? Sadly, though there was a competition, as those of you know in this room, because some of you participated in it, submitted an entry for an appropriate monument for World War I in Washington. And why World War I in Washington? Why should it be so important? Because of this largely still neglected and unknown fact. It was the American troops that broke the back of the German army in the closing months in late August, September, and October of 1918. And at a horrific cost, at the cost of more than 100,000 dead. Because the worst casualties were not during trench warfare, in spite of the artillery barrages. They were in the first 6 months of the war and the closing 5 months of the war, because that's when people were out in the open. The field of battle was not static. And so here we have what probably will end up being built, probably a very fine piece of bronze relief. I have no doubt that it's fine. I know a number of people who are participating in executing it. But the authorities and the bureaucracy basically ultimately took away the site from the competition and said the park has to be preserved, basically 80% of what's there, and restored. They gave to the monument merely the reflecting pool. So the monument forms one edge of a reflecting pool. Now think about what kind of ceremonies can occur, what kind of commemorations can occur in a reflecting pool. It is not just pathetic, it's rather criminal. So on that point, thank you very much. And any questions? We deserve better, they deserve better, is my point. So, the monuments commemorate those who are not here, out of the horrors of industrialized slaughter. And there's painting.